A very good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Xuan Yo and I'm one of the 2 Earth Fellows this year. In 2007, 60 years after the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s, a suitcase was found containing 4,500 negatives of photographs from the Spanish Civil War. Capturing harrowing images of war and of ordinary people living in the Spanish towns and countryside held by the anti-Franco forces during the Spanish Civil War, the photographs were taken by Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, and David Seymour, also known as Chim. These 3 photographers who lived in Paris, worked in Spain, and published internationally, pioneered a new form of war photography, focusing not just on the events of the battlefields, but also on the experiences of civilians. Their work has long been considered some of the most innovative and passionate coverage of the Spanish Civil War. As you might have realized by now, 15 of those images found in the suitcase, together with some facsimiles of international newspapers and magazines from the 1930s where those images were published at that time, are on display on the walls of this dining room. The captions on those images, I must add, were authored by a group of students here at the Claremont colleges. This evening, we're pleased to have with us Ms. Cynthia Young, the curator of the Robert Capa Archive at the International Center of Photography in New York City. She recently curated Capa in Color, which looked at Robert Capa's color photography for the first time. A retrospective of Chim, we went back photographs from Europe 1933 to 1956 by Chim, and in 2010, the Mexican Suitcase, the rediscovered negatives of the Spanish Civil War by Capa, Chim, and Taro. All 3 exhibitions have traveled and continue to travel throughout Europe, Mexico, and Brazil. Her Athenaeum talk this evening will explore the research process and discoveries of what has come to be known as the Mexican Suitcase. Ms. Young's Athenaeum talk this evening and the exhibit are co-sponsored by the Athenaeum, the Rick and Susan Sontag Center for Collaborative Creativity, and the Mellon Presidential Roundtable on Creativity Grant. As always, I must remind you that all audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Cynthia Young to the Athenaeum.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I want to thank, first of all, the Athenaeum, the fellows, Rio Janar, and also Raquel Vega Duran. They were so welcoming and enthusiastic about bringing the photographs and me here to speak. And while I've spoken about the work in France and Spain, in Budapest, I have never spoken about this work in the United States. I've only spoken about it in New York, so this is really exciting to speak to an American audience, and particularly one with so many students too, because I think there's just so much information packed into these 3 little boxes that it's just the beginning of the kind of questions that we can start to answer that I'll present here tonight. So I really want to suggest and talk about the work as really kind of an unpuzzling of the negatives that were in the suitcase. It was when they first arrived at the International Center of Photography in the December of 2007, we really had no idea what was inside. We actually understood that the work was all the work of Robert Capa. But in fact, it's the work of 3, if actually a 4th photographer who I'll mention in a moment, Fred Stein, 3 photographers who we knew worked together at various moments, but the fact that their work was packed together and so intertwined sort of brought a whole new understanding of how these 3 photographers, all foreigners working in Paris, photographed the Spanish Civil War for the international press. This first contact sheet of a roll of film was by Taro, and I knew that because sort of on the second to last row is a photograph of a burning truck. This was taken in Brunete right before she was killed by a truck on the Republican side, actually, because she refused to pull away from the battlefield as she was told again and again, it's too dangerous. But she really wanted to stay as close as she can to the action. But I just had, I had no idea what these other images were and what they would tell us about her work. And this roll of film by Chim of in the Basque country of an outdoor mass of the Basque soldiers who were fighting for Republican side, even though they were of the Catholic, of the very Catholic Basque country, and very interesting and important propaganda story, really, for the Republican side. But here to see them in sequential order was really so extraordinary. Here's one of the photographs from the outdoor mass, which is actually from a completely different perspective from the image that's on the wall there. So if you can keep this in your memory and go back to the wall and see that. And just to see Chim moving around his subject is something that was nearly impossible to see from a few edited prints from these negatives. But to finally see the contact sheet and to see how he worked and tried to and depicted his subject was something completely new. And then this roll of film of what we understood to be a reenactment of a battle that Capa and Taro created really for the camera a month after something had happened. But what would these images tell us about that story? And this roll of film by Capa from the Battle of Tourelle, this poignant photograph of soldiers on the ground after this very bloody battle. And then these photographs, the last and one of the largest subjects in the suitcase of over 500,000 refugees who crossed the French border, escaping persecution by the nationalists at the end of the war. The photographs that Capa took, what would we learn from that? And then these photographs. Here you can see Capa and Taro sitting together in a Parisian cafe. It's the only two photographs we have of the two of them together, actually. This was a time when these very young photographers were barely scraping by to sell their photographs as photojournalists. They didn't take snapshots of each other. They didn't waste their film on anything that couldn't be published, as you will see in the contact sheets that I'll show you. So this roll of film and a few others were taken by Fred Stein, who I'll talk about actually in a moment. The Mexican Suitcase was no suitcase at all. It was 3 boxes of film, of 35 millimeter black and white film. This was one box. This was another box. And this was the third box. This is actually a box of about 8 by 10 black and white photographic paper by Ilford, which is, I think, a company that's still actually in production today. The other 2 boxes were commercial boxes that were sold to house film. It's a complicated story and so rich in sort of international intrigue, friends, strangers, that it made its way from Paris to the south of France to Mexico City to New York. But the little we know that at the end of the war in 1939, in the spring of 1939, Capa and Chim were in Paris. Taro had died 2 years earlier. They knew they had to leave Paris. They were foreigners, Jewish, and communist sympathizers, and they were not getting work anymore. Chim took a boat. He took an assignment for life to cover actually Spanish refugees sailing to Mexico, which he really used as a way of escape. And then Capa, who tried to get American visa, was denied and eventually got a Chilean visa. Took a boat across the Atlantic and actually just jumped ship in New York and joined his mother and his brother in New York. But when they left in the spring of '39, I think together they, with their darkroom assistant Chiki Weiss, who was also a Hungarian photographer, packed some, not all, of many, but not all, of their best photographs from Spain. They packed their work as well as Gerda Taro's work. What's interesting is that it's not all their best work. Some of it was left out. It's not all of any one of the 3 photographers' work. And so I sort of believe that it was for some sort of a project. that they were eventually going to do probably in New York, where they were hoping to meet up. They both left Paris. The darkroom assistant stayed in Paris, and it became increasingly difficult for him to survive. He said he biked down to the south of France in the chaos there of various other refugees trying to get out of France. He gave these negatives to someone for safekeeping. He didn't remember who later on. He was eventually turned in North Africa, and in 1942 got out with the help and money of Robert Capa and his brother Cornel Capa. They went missing since that time. Cornel Capa, who desperately worked to sort of gather together all of his brother's work when he died in 1954, just couldn't find these negatives. He went on a dig in France, because many negatives were actually buried for safekeeping during the war, but there was just no trace of where to even look for them. And it wasn't until 1995 he got a letter from a man in Mexico City saying, "I think I have your brother's negatives." It turned out that this man's family member actually had been the Mexican ambassador to Vichy in 41 and 42, and it was likely that he had it in his possessions when he left when he left France and came back to Mexico City, where they sat probably untouched until he died and his wife died. And then the man in Mexico City, who was a filmmaker, was given the negatives because they figured he knew what to do with them. And then after quite some years of negotiation, the man gave them to the International Center of Photography, which was founded by Robert Capa's brother, Cornel Capa. So the ICP already had, we have about 15,000 vintage prints. We have many of his negatives. We have his letters and papers. So it's sort of, they fit into what was there, including, this great document of Robert Capa's press card from 1939. Just a word about the Mexican suitcase and why it's called the Mexican suitcase when it's not a suitcase at all. There had been a suitcase found in the Swedish embassy in 1979, and containing photographs by Capa, Taro, and Chim of the Spanish Civil War. And it was thought at that time that these were the negatives, but there were no negatives. It was just prints and papers by the last president of Spain, Juan Negrin, who left Spain at the end of the war, and left this suitcase full of his important papers in the Swedish embassy, and then died in 1956. And actually, the suitcase was sent to Sweden. They only divulged actually what they had after Franco had died, and then returned that suitcase and all of its contents to Spain. So when this letter came from Mexico about this potential trove of material, it was immediately dubbed within Cornell and his circle the Mexican suitcase, but it wasn't a suitcase. So now you know that story, and how these kind of these sort of fantastic titles do stick, even if it's a long story on why. This is also a document that we have of Chim, another press card of his. And sadly, Taro, who really only photographed for 1 year, we have no press card of hers to show you. But opening the suitcase, the first box, this is what I first saw. And it's hard to read, but on the top of the box, written in the squares, are just names of places. Toled, actually it's in French. Toled on the bottom, going across, Sabadell, just large and small towns in Spain, sometimes names of people, but no names of photographers, and in some cases you can see they're blank. But looking at the film, I could see mostly that the film, that Toled related to this roll of film. So those were photographs of Toledo, and it really worked for most of it. So that was sort of the first clue on what was there and how to identify it. This is the other box as you opened it. And here you can see there's starting to get a little bit more confusion since there's more that's unlabeled. You can see multiple handwritten writings actually on the top of the box. I think possibly Capa was involved, studio manager. I think the other box was actually more written all by Chim because it mostly contained his work. He was a little more organized about his archive than Capa. And another element of identification that we had on the physical negatives themselves was just at the leader of many of the rolls of film. I'm hoping that you all know what a roll of film is, even because it's so infrequently used today. But this is, of course, a 35 millimeter film, which was revolutionary in the 30s because you didn't have to put in a new plate. It came on rolls of 36. You could photograph for a while. It was used in a small handheld 35 millimeter camera where you could move quickly, get very close to your subject. So it was sort of the ideal medium for photojournalism. And it was part of the revolution of photojournalism in that time. So here on the leader, you can see, 1CH. And actually, that reflected what was box 1. There's actually, all the boxes have numbers written. So mostly those numbers corresponded to the box they were in. Not always, but it was just had to take shreds of information wherever I could see it. And the CH corresponded to Chim, and I noticed with all of the Chim material, there was this very pronounced under magnification bump right there. So, it wasn't flat across, but in every single one of his negatives, there was this bump, which was probably something that he chiseled out of his camera that he used, probably to identify which negatives were his. If negatives were batch processed, he could know immediately which ones that he had taken. And this made a difference when there were times where I just didn't know whose was whose. I didn't recognize the work, and it was messed up with other rolls of film, and it wasn't clear. And so this microscopic analyzation of the photographs, it was really only available through digital scanning, became very important to the work. This is one of the Capa films. You can see 51, so that was the first roll of film in the second box. C corresponded to Capa. This is a roll of film that I know was by Taro, and here you have it clearly labeled Capa. So that was, sometimes the information given was incorrect, which also suggests the confusion in 1939 of whose work was whose, whether it was Capa who didn't recognize what he had taken, what Taro had taken, or the studio manager or someone else. Or that, authorship meant something else at that time. And it's not so much a question of him stealing her work, but really for speed and efficiency, the work was labeled his. And then there were some rolls of film labeled T for Taro, but there were only 8 rolls of film labeled T for Taro, and so as I mentioned before, some of her work was labeled Capa or not at all. This is the third box of film, and this was all film that was actually cut into strips and then labeled, but you can see Terrell listed right in the middle. Some of the Terrell photographs were in another box of the rolled film. So it was really, things were in, in disparate places, and rolls of film really had to be reconstructed using, either sort of digital details that I could see microscopically, holding 2 pieces of film next to each other, or research through the magazines or other photographs we had. This is a photograph of Fred Stein, who's the fourth photographer, who's barely mentioned because he's sort of an anomaly within the Mexican Suitcase, yet very, very, of course he was present in the Mexican Suitcase. He, like the 3 other photographers, was a Jewish immigrant who escaped from Germany into Paris in 1933 when he realized he couldn't practice law. And when he arrived in Paris and decided to take up photography as a portrait photographer. Gerda Taro came from Germany, and she met Stein and used his darkroom, so they became friends. But she also posed as a terrific subject for him as he was learning how to make portraits. And you can see this roll of film here. And there are 4 rolls of film of her by Fred Stein. And I think the reason why these rolls of film are included within the context of these photographs from the Spanish Civil War is because once she had died in 1937, she was, by all accounts, the great love of Robert Capa, and he was completely bereft when she did die. That she became inextricably linked to the Spanish Civil War and the work that he did there, and even the Swedish Suitcase that I mentioned earlier, within the 100 prints by Capa, Taro, and Chim, there was actually a portrait of her. Not a portrait of Capa and Chim, who were still alive, but her portrait was a part of, really one of the people who had, fought and died for the Republican cause in Spain. And here's another lovely picture, and then of course this fantastic photograph of the 2 of them right before leaving for Spain in Paris. So as I said, the magazines were a really important sort of point of reference to understand what these photographs were and why, and sort of to identify the photographer and identify, and try to understand why these negatives were interesting. We have, 1,000 vintage prints from Spain, so it's not as if we needed more images, but what can a contact sheet show you that a single print or even a group of images published by the magazine can't? This was a story published in 1937. It was a story you can see was captions "Photo Capa e Taro." They didn't always travel and photograph together, but in some cases they did. And when they did, they got a joint credit, which also was helpful to the magazine because they didn't have to worry, put individual captions underneath each photograph. So it was a story, we just didn't know whose was whose. We had prints in the archive, same image, one stamped Capa, one stamped Taro, but it was really impossible to tell from that. But within the suitcase, there were 3 rolls of film from this one story. And here you can see that photograph on the far right of a soldier going through a little hole in the wall. And here, that image is here, as well as many other images from the front, the Western Front in Madrid. And then this fantastic photograph also from the medical university, which was really the last point of defense for the Republicans in Madrid against Franco. And then this very striking image of showing the sort of desperate conditions in some of the battles. And so in one of the photographs from that roll of film, I was looking at it very closely, and I saw this. This is Gerda Taro. And you can see she's actually holding her her Leica camera around her neck. And I actually am quite convinced that Robert Capa didn't even see that she was in the frame, because he wasn't usually sloppy like that, and you never see her in any of the other photographs. But it was a wonderful detail to have now, because we could identify that roll as being all taken by Capa, and that the other roll that had very similar images, but not the Taro image, was by Taro. And we could really see side by side how they photographed the same story, but quite differently. Here's the 2 rolls of film, and they really start out very similarly. There's a parade of soldiers on the street, and then they go into the trenches outside of the university center, the medical center, or medical university. And I think, actually, sort of inexplicable, but there's a bear in one of these images that had been, I think, brought to the front. It was one of sort of a tame bear. And then you can see sort of these, at the end of the sort of monuments at the end of outside in the trenches. So really, it was one of the only times we could compare, I mean, really side by side, they're two different styles. And on the top is Taro's images, and the bottom is Capa. And you can see Taro is standing on some sort of platform. Maybe she climbed up on a street lamp. She's really interested in that strong vertical composition. She was very well versed in Soviet constructivist films in Germany. She had a more formal aesthetic education, and even her earlier work had very strong aesthetic lines and strong compositions. And then Capa's here. He is crouching right on the street. He's very close. One soldiers were literally coming into our frame, and that's so indicative of his sort of physical, emotional presence in the photographs that he became famous for. As much as the work was about separating Capa from Taro, in the last case, in this one, it was really about separating Chim and Capa. As I said, we really didn't know how much integration they had, not just in Spain, but also in Paris. We had no idea that they used the same darkroom or had negatives in the same studio. This was a story that Chim photographed quite in the early fall of 1936. This is La Pasionaria, who was a great figure, one of the great female leaders for the Republican side. She made many radio addresses and was incredibly well known through those. And she's giving a speech to new recruits in Madrid. And again, Chim is going around to the scene, photographing it from above, from great perspective, and then going close to the podium and photographing her and the other speakers. But I looked at the numbers on the film, and the first three were number 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then there was a jump, and we had 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, and then it went down and finished, continuous for the rest of the film. And, there were lots of missing films. It was wonderful when we had a full film, but there was film missing all over the place. So that didn't bother me so much. But and here's a detail of La Pasionaria speaking. But then when I was going through the ICP archive of work that we had from a long time ago that Capa had as his death, I found this piece of film of the same subject, and there was the missing 16, 17 to 21, and the same crowd. Well, actually, sorry, you can see the crowd, and then this detail of a boy wearing the copper union's cap, but it fit in perfectly there with the rest of the material. And it's what was so extraordinary about this is that because it had been in the Capa archive, that photograph of the little boy had been, considered a wonderful and iconic Capa photograph, but in fact it's now become an iconic Chim photograph through research on this. Another point of reference that we had in the ICP collection were these, and also in an archive in Paris, were these notebooks. They didn't, despite the fact that I keep talking about contact sheets and showing them, they actually didn't use contact sheets or make contact sheets really until World War II. It was just not a way the photojournalist was archiving or even evaluating their own work. They actually probably made a contact sheet, and then they cut them up and pasted them into these notebooks. This is a notebook that Capa and Taro shared together in their first trip to Spain in the fall late summer of 36, right when the war started. That was when she was using a Rolly camera that provided big square negatives. So all the square negatives are by Taro, and the little 35s are by Capa, who was by that time only working with his 35 millimeter camera. But this was interesting because at the bottom, you can see this man in a white shirt and a big tall hat seen in this photograph, and there in the suitcase, you could see the same group of soldiers, but the same man right in the tall hat and the white shirt. And so we were able to identify, that these were Capas, and there was this exact moment and scene. These notebooks were something they continued to make. There are 8 more of these notebooks in the Archives Nationales in Paris. Another long story of why they have them. They were at the Republican propaganda office in Paris in the early 40s and were confiscated with material there, and so now they're in the archive. But this was a later notebook from 37, and judging from these images, we know that actually they're from 3 different rolls of film, that they were mixed together. There was no notion of chronology or sequence that a context sheet would provide. These are just really a catalog of images that they would use to actually note where an image was published, but also to show to the editors so they could pick and choose. But you can see the order or the aesthetic of this is mostly, keep the verticals together, surrounded by a few of the horizontals and the sides in the middle. It made sense to them, even though it's sort of a funny idea now. This is another photograph, another notebook of just Taro's work. And here, again, you can see this very strong composition in the way she's putting together images. But this is, from 2 rolls of film, I think. And then this notebook was from end of 1938, so over 2 years into the war, where Capa had become one of the most important international journalists in Spain. And you can see the notebook is looking completely different. It's really functioning as a context sheet. It's really in an order with a very clear numbering system that they can use to archive images and number prints on the back. Although he made some little sequence order at the end, because I think he wanted to end this page with a really dramatic moment of this wounded soldier being brought in back to the rest of the soldiers. So he took a few little liberties, but mostly it's a very straightforward sequence of the original photographs. And this is a page from the Chim notebook, the one Chim notebook. And he used the notebooks totally differently than Capa and Taro, who put everything, all their negatives in. They didn't edit anything out. And they put all the rough stories together, even if it wasn't one context sheet per page. It was still the same rough story. This is from 3 or 4 different stories, but they're all portraits. So that's really how he wanted to see these photographs. He was an obsessive editor of his work, so if there were 50 photographs of one story, I think there are only 20 images in the notebook. So it just gave a new understanding of how Chim, who was a few years older and a little more experienced as a photojournalist, he'd had sort of a 2-year career before the war started, was almost a little secretive, but just more maybe demanding of himself and his own work and what he wanted to show the editors. So this is one of the context sheets where you can see some of the faces on that last page, and then in the middle there, Javier Bueno, who is the editor of a leftist newspaper in the Basque Country, also, but plucked out of this series and put onto the page of portraits. This is the smallest story in the suitcase, but one of the strongest. It's by Chim. It actually was taken before the war started in the spring of 36, right when the Popular Front won the elections, and the French newspaper Regarde, that was also a very leftist workers socialist magazine, sent him down to Spain to cover the sort of chaos following the elections. They wanted to see, what was life in this country, and it was an important subject for for France to cover for the French magazine, because the Popular Front also was coming into power too, with tentative future. This story was from a land reform meeting, and you can see some of the images published on the right. And it was a meeting that apparently went on, if you read the text, for about 6 hours, and many peasants stayed just to hear about their new rights in the land. And so again, typical of Chim, going so close to the faces, this incredible face of this woman who probably isn't as old as she looks, and then pulling back to the crowd as they all raise their hands in solidarity. But probably the most famous image is of this, published in a German magazine at the time. And she really, sort of is so emblematic of Mother Earth, nursing her baby while, understanding her new rights, while these wonderful little faces are peeking in. It was also used on the cover of a propaganda magazine, published a year later too, and you can see it was montaged in with these German and Italian fighter planes with the bomb hanging over it. So for years, actually, this photograph was captioned as Madrid, 1937, woman looking at bombs overhead. Somehow, just the original context was so lost. And not only that, we also really only knew it from this image, which was similar to the crop of here. It was a copy negative of a copy print, very contrasty, very dark, very, sort of very sooty. And it's incredible when you see it in context, next to the full original negative, which is so luminous and has so much more detail too of all the other figures around it. And I just contrasted with Dorothea Lange's American photograph of a Native American mother from 1936, the same year. And she's sort of an icon of the Dust Bowl and the poverty that America was going through at that time. And it's interesting that they both had, both photographers were really using the woman as an icon for both of these crisis periods. This story by Chim was really interesting to see in the context sheets. It was a story of the protection of the arts in Madrid. The Republicans were being bashed as destroyers of any culture and tradition. They were found to smash religious statues and have no respect for great Spanish tradition. But in fact, the nationalists took over this great this palace actually of Duke d'Alba in Madrid, sort of took it over and created it as a people's museum, and then also took out all of the work from the De Casas monastery that also had great treasures. And Chim elegantly and passionately photographed this moment of the soldiers inventorying the art, carrying it, and using all the weighted a significance of two soldiers carrying the cross here. This was it was the first story that was very, very widely reproduced in magazine. This is Este Pueblo from it's of the people in a German magazine. It was actually published in Czechoslovakia, but it was still functioning in German. And then, of course, this one in France. And then this American book of work of the three photographers too. Of course, and then this is American magazine. I mean, it goes on. I think this is only just a fraction of the magazines that published these photographs. It was so important as a moment to show what the Republicans, to contrast the accusations the Republicans were not defenders and protectors of great Spanish heritage. So these photographs start at the end of this roll, and you can see here these photographs, three photographs here, and then the photograph of the two soldiers carrying the crucifix. And it's so important, the subject, that you can see he continues it in the next roll of film. Taking them from different angles. He really needs to get this right. And what's striking is that although there are only 5 photographs, or 4 of each subject, 4 was a really a big number for one subject for these photographers at this time. Film was very precious to them. They didn't have access to a lot, and every photograph really had to count, and that's why they didn't take snapshots of each other. Every photograph had to be something that the editors might use on the cover or the inside of the story. And here, the close-up of that same story. And I think, here he actually turns around so he can get the band of the soldier that says, protection of the arts brigade, something. This is a story by Taro. I think when you really see her formal qualities interacting with the content of the story. This is really when Stalin's money started infiltrating and radically changing the Republicans. They got uniforms, there was a hierarchy, women weren't allowed anymore. And it was, there was a certain amount of promise, although it radically changed the spirit of the Republican Army. But you can see, her interest in these formal constructivist compositions. Even this contact sheet from a distance, you can, see the lines forming in each frame. And what I think is so interesting too about this story in 3 different rolls of film, even 4, and here's a close-up of the soldiers lining up, is that you had both that image before, and then you have this, which is much more snapshotty, and more about sort of the little details of the event, and not so sort of heroic and iconic like the other images. This is a story by Taro that I think really could only have been taken by Taro, and really, it really really shows how Taro, in some ways, personified and really was the subject for Capa's famous dictum: if your pictures aren't close enough, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. And I think he really saw that in Taro's work. In the beginning, this is a story in Valencia following a bombing in May of 37, or April of May 14th, 37. And these are pictures of the morgue. She goes directly into the morgue and photographs some of the bodies there, and also some of the families pressed against the grates, waiting to get inside to identify family members. And it's a story that Capa would have never taken. With Capa, death is really, one frame behind or after. It's really outside of the immediate image itself. But with Taro, she went straight for it. And the beginning of the film is of the grate of the people pressed against. And it's really, sort of, in some ways, sort of the ideal contact sheet. It's sort of the rough draft of a poem that really becomes her masterpiece. She's literally moving from right to left along the grate there, trying to find the right faces, the right composition. And then in the 7th frame, she turns her camera vertically, and then in the 8th frame, she goes in. And it's, you see her working and thinking, and it's that photograph, that last photograph, the 8th photograph, that makes it on the cover of the magazine. And it's just to see that at work is something that is so it's so valuable and special for a photo historian to see, to start to understand how the approach is a real struggle. It's not just the immediate decisive moment, the perfect image, but something that has to be felt and sought out. Of course, this was right after Guernica, so you can see the titles of the story here. This is an interesting story. the story that, as I mentioned earlier, that Capa and Taro recreated for the camera. It was a month after this small town had been taken by the Republicans, and they arrived, and it was, completely barren, and the battle was over, but they needed photographs from the camera. Apparently, Capa was filming with a film camera, and Taro was photographing. So here you can see the soldiers kind of running towards the town, and then this is another roll of film. There's more running, but you can see at the top of this is the soldiers running. They're getting closer. One falls. It looks very dramatic. The top of the second roll of film, here you have cigarette break. The change of roll of film. And it's really, there was question on really what this story was, but, undoubtedly it was a recreation for the camera. And interestingly, and, sort of so obviously, as we went through all the magazines, that Ce Soir magazine from Paris was the only magazine that published this. And again, as we look closely at Ce Soir and look closely at the captions and looking at the images they chose, they were clearly the ones that were the least interested in factual accuracy. Pictures that were captioned Madrid, which I know very well, were Turrell. They said last week in Madrid, and I knew that it was taken 6 months ago. So of course they would be interested in this story because it looks like something, but no other magazine published these images. This is actually a film still from a film that Henri Cartier-Bresson made. If you don't know him, he was a good friend of Capa and Chim's in Paris, and was a very important photographer in the mid-20th century, less for his work in Spain because he mostly did films, but more for really incredible compositions and poetic moments in sort of, around the world as he traveled. But in Spain, he actually did films that were used films to gain money to send to the Spanish volunteers in Spain. This was a film to raise money for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which is a group of Americans who fought in the Spanish Civil War. And so it was really a very different kind of work than what Capa was doing, which was for the magazine, but this was sort of a relief kind of work. And it was a Spanish researcher at NYU who was working in New York at the time where I was working in the Mexican Suitcase. So I invited him in to look at the negatives. And when he saw this contact sheet, he became very excited because you'll see this little man with holding his stake right there is exactly this man here. And it was very clear that within this film of Cartier-Bresson's, he had footage that Capa had shot in Spain. Capa, as you can see, well, I can assure you that he sort of used the film camera as a still camera. There's not a lot of action in his film, the bits of film that we know now, but they were helpful for Cartier-Bresson to add to his film, really at the front and the back of his film, often with the subtitles or super titles about sort of placing what this film was, because it was a silent film. But it was a fascinating moment to understand that Cartier-Bresson was also collaborating with Capa at that time in 1938. It was much earlier than we knew. They had really been working together and thinking how that their work together as a collaborative was much more valuable, as anyone individually. And then this roll of film from close to the end of the war in Barcelona. The Republicans. It was January of 1939. There was really, the nationalists had taken over much of Spain, and Catalonia was really the last remaining area. It was really, in some ways, only a matter of weeks, but still there was resistance in the city. And they placed a downed Henkel plane right in the middle of the city, and all the Spaniards came and were looking at it closely. And it's kind of important and poignant to remember that none of these people had ever been in a plane, let alone seen a commercial airline, but only fighter pilots flying above. I mean, it was this new mass weapon of destruction that targeted civilians, which was a totally new concept in war. In war, but of course the children started climbing over and do what children do, and uses as a kind of jungle gym. And Capa took these great photographs of the children playing on this. But what was so pointed about this particular image was when it was published in the Barcelona papers at the time when the suitcase first appeared, and a man saw these pictures and he recognized himself in that photograph. And that he wasn't the only person who recognized himself or a family member in the images. And that sort of added a whole new dimension to these negatives, because we'd identified officers, and we'd identified some, Lincoln Brigaders, we'd identified, La Pasionaria, but really most of them were about anonymous citizens, soldiers who were fighting or living within this civil war. And so to be able to put people's personal stories on how they survived the war, many of whom left Spain afterwards, was something that happened as the exhibition traveled to Spanish cities in the south of France. As well. This is the last photographs that Capa made of the war. These were made in March of 1939. He had left Spain in January, went back up to Paris, and heard reports of these concentration camps in the south of France, where these 500,000 refugees were literally being placed. They were just put on the beach with no facilities. They were then put into these work situations where they were building latrines, they were building houses, and the French magazines weren't publishing the story. It was just these reports, and Capa thought, I have to make images. So he went down, and apparently went down as Andre Friedman from America, which is interesting, because by then Robert Capa, which was the name he took in 1935 when he moved to Paris, was really an internationally recognized photojournalist. But I think he knew that he probably wouldn't get in as Robert Capa, and would have to go in and as this sort of schlummy photographer, Andre Friedman, who'd no one ever heard of. And so so over 2 days he visited 4 different camps and shot. We have 11 rolls of the camps, and this was really a really incredible ending for Capa, who had gone down to Spain with Taro, with Chim, with such great hopes for the Republican, to photograph for the Republican side. I mean, it was really we have to stop fascism here and now, and we will use our photographs as our weapon, and for this to be, to see all of his fellow soldiers, let alone actually one photographer who we met in Spain in these photographs. It was a thoroughly depressing experience for him, and he wrote a little bit about it. But I wanted to just show 15 of these photographs from this one roll of film, just to show in some ways how I think his experience doing a little bit of filming in the 2 years earlier had started to affect his work, and also just the difference on how he was using film at that time, and how much more access he had to film, being film for the camera, being such a renowned photographer, and how much more money he had for material. And these are just in sequence. These are some of the prisoners being moved from one end of one area of a camp to another because it was overcrowding and flowing. This is another roll of film, probably that followed this. This story was only published in 2 magazines in Europe, Picture Post from London and Zeit magazine from Sweden. Of course, the French did not publish this. Regard magazine, that had been such a supporter of Capa and Chim and Taro, leftist, workers, socialist, really took a radically right turn right in 1939, and we're not publishing any of his stories that year. Titled "The Forgotten Army." And this is from the Swedish Zeit magazine. But even you can see in these 2 examples how more prominent the photographs are from some of the examples that I showed you from the beginning of the war in 1936, when most of their photographs were really illustrations to accompany a text by a journalist, whereas here there's no journalist credited. It's the photographs that are speaking. These photographs were also used in brochures, American brochures, relief brochures, where this was just a 2-page flyer where there was a little information about these children and asking people to adopt, send a little money to adopt these refugee children in these concentration camps. And then this is another flyer, again, used for the same purpose. So, this, so much of, even right here at this moment, there's a shift in actually how Capa's work was being used. There was the start of using photojournalism within NGO or relief projects, not just the magazines, or even not the magazines at all, which is how some photojournalists today are working. But it had references, sort of beginnings at this time, at the end of the war, when the refugee crisis was so dire and serious. So that's really the end of the talk. There's really so much more that the suitcase reveals, and it's, someone compared it to the Pandora's box, but really it's more like the Rosetta Stone, in the sense that it gave us a framework to understand so many other things, and it was really a language in which it made other areas and other languages so much richer. And again, as I said, I think there's so much more work to be done in any one of these areas, even in things that I didn't even talk about tonight. But the future is for you. Thank you. So I think I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. So we now have time for questions. If you have one, please raise your hand and Chuen or I will come to you, and preference goes to students.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I wanted to ask, you mentioned some of the perhaps political motivations of the photographers in going to Spain. What was sort of the impact that they were able to have, if it was significant, in perhaps affecting the war in some shape or form? Thank you.
Well, it was I think there was great hope for anyone who went to Spain to fight or to support the Republicans. In 1937, there was a non-interventionist pact signed by England and France and America, and Germany and Italy too, about not interfering and not selling arms and material to Spain. But of course, Germany and Italy just broke it, but England and France and America really refused to help the Republicans. So, of course, Russia did, but with consequences. What's extraordinary is, despite that, Capa didn't give up. He continued to go back and forth to Spain from Paris. He would go for a few weeks and then come back, process, do a few stories in France, and then go back. He went to China, actually, in 1938 for about 8 months. Was really photographing the Sino-Japanese war there. It was really the sort of eastern front of the fight against fascism. He thought he could, again, make photographs that would help at least educate people about what was going on. But he came back to Paris, and then 2 weeks later he went back to Spain in 1938 and stayed until the end of January the next year. So it wasn't something. It was not an assignment for him. He deeply believed in the cause, and he deeply wanted to make images that would make a difference. So I don't know if that so much answers your question. It's just, was hard. It wasn't pointless. It has, dramatic effects today, and for sure on the history of these images and the circulation of the media at that time, which played a big role in for both sides.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I really enjoyed listening to all the stories that you told through the photographs, and I wondered, when you choose to display these photographs, if you're trying to tell the stories as you think the photographers originally wanted them to be told, or whether you find stories that you think are important and can pick out and kind of craft in your own way. Our Spanish class went to the Goya exhibit in Pomona's museum, and the curator expressed that there was sort of a modern obsession with original intent, and I wondered if you could weigh in on that.
Yeah, in some ways they were kind of one-to-one in terms of what the editor wanted. These three photographers were not objective journalists for today's standards. They were completely partisan. There were no photographs of any nationalists. There was no attempt to show the other side. The only nationalists that you see in any of the photographs are a few prisoners. And that was absolutely expected in some ways by the editors of the magazines that they were really selling their work to. Their intent was to make photographs that would raise consciousness or stir the hearts of the magazine readers of these, of sympathetic magazines. I think there's rare instance of something other than that. What was interesting and what you don't ever see in the magazines, and I didn't really show tonight, but I can tell you of Chim's photographs, that he documented a lot of architectural details in a lot of the monuments that he was, he came across, particularly in the Basque area. I mean, there was something very, I think he understood the importance of documenting something that was in grave danger of being destroyed in this conflict. Those photographs didn't get published, and I don't know whether he thought they might, or that it was just a personal mission. So I think that's an interesting area to explore. But it was really just him. He grew up in a very culturally cultured background. His father owned a Yiddish printing press in Warsaw, so his background was a little more intellectual than Capa's. He was a son of his mother was a tailor. His father was sort of a gambler, he was more of a worker. It really had to, be an immediate exchange. I photograph for magazines. I produce for magazines.
Thank you so much for your talk. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the example of the young man later recognizing himself in one of the photographs, and I'm wondering what other examples you've experienced of these photographs facilitating a connection between the past and the present in that way. Thank you.
Right. Well, in New York, there was a photograph, a cover of a magazine, of a Regard magazine, of a woman sitting on a suitcase writing a letter, a young woman, 20s. And someone visiting from Spain saw that and said, "Oh my gosh, that is my grandmother." We'd heard of this magazine with her picture, but they never saw it because the magazine didn't circulate internationally. It was a French magazine. That was one example. And then, she told the story of she was from a small town. She came to Barcelona as a refugee. A lot of people came and sought shelter in big stadium there, which was where the photograph was made. In another, there were so many. The MNAC, Museo Nacional de Catalunya, when it was the exhibition went there, they created a very dynamic website with details of a lot of the children, because they really wanted for people to look hard at the photographs, and some people recognized themselves there. I think the woman who's actually doing the transcribing of the art of the story that I showed you, I think her family identified her, and she was very much a part of this cataloging, very careful cataloging of the artwork in Madrid. So I mean, really, that's actually a project I would love to do, is to put all those stories and gather them in one book or website, because that's a very meaningful, part of this story that was impossible and not at all what the magazines were interested at that time. Today, I think it would be very different. You might get the name of the person and identify what they're doing, but at the time, the magazines were much more removed in the story of the individual. So that would be a very contemporary, going back to your question about sort of a very contemporary look on, it's quite different than their original intent.
Hi, thank you for coming. Did they always make it explicit when they were constructing these images? And is it a question as a curator, how do you sort of represent, are these authentic images, or have they been sort of recreations?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's all sort of authentic on a certain level. I mean, it's it was. I think, again, the photographs of the soldiers carrying the crucifix out of the monastery, they were absolutely posing for the camera. I mean, he told them to stop, move, no, move here, closer to the, I want a dark background so the white of the sculpture is more accentuated. But I think this, but it was for a purpose, and I think it's, they weren't, it was a different sense of stage, the word staging didn't mean anything. I mean, up until the Spanish Civil War, most war photographs were staged because, in part, the technology insisted on long exposures because, the camera was heavy, it needed a tripod, you had to sit still. They certainly weren't photographing battle anywhere close to any action, so anything had to really be recreated for the camera. So this new 35 millimeter camera allowed, even the semblance of veracity, or of this idea of immediate one-to-one documentation of an actual event that was so radical in '36. And even one caption, I think by Time magazine, they said you don't have to stage photographs in Spain, and it was so accepted as a practice that at that time, but now it's become such a different idea of such has negative connotations. So they did in some cases, as I said, particularly in that one stage, but it was written in journals that they had done that. So that was really the one case where it was highly, credited as a staged event, a recreated staged event for the camera. But as I said, certain magazines stayed away from those.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is so exciting for me. I remember reading in the LA Times an article about that big, about the discovery of this suitcase. And I was hoping that you'd be able to describe the atmosphere, how excited you were, how excited everybody was when you finally got to see some of these negatives. If you could describe that, that would be wonderful.
Well, to be clear, I touched his negatives before because we had many in the archive in advance of the arrival of the suitcase. But, opening the box the first time was pretty extraordinary, considering also, and the people in the room, some of who had really been involved with Cornell Capa over, years of kind of complicated letter writing back and forth in Mexico City and missed, meetings to finally have it in New York and to see this. But it was, kind of in trepidation. What was this? We only had a few images that the man in Mexico had scanned. So we were sure they were Capas. But what else was there? Just to look at these films was just all the latent potential of photography, and then to really even look through the negatives and hold them under a light box was, it's in some ways like seeing an animated film come alive. I knew this shot and I knew that shot, but to get to one to the other was extraordinary to see. And also the physical quality of actually shifting the film. You could, it was really the move. It was like animation. But.
I have a question myself about we talked about how these photographers were really pioneers in this form of war photography, and I was wondering if you know of any other photographers who have actually cited a direct influence from any of these three people, and what kind of work have they been involved in?
Well, they were certainly three within a moment where photojournalism was radically changing, with the printing press, with news magazines, a greater readership, leisure time, just sort of general, international awareness. So they are not alone. There were other journalists in Germany working, in England, in America. But for sure, many photojournalists, when they're out, they're looking for, a Robert Capa photograph. They're looking for the one photograph that is going to change the conversation of the conflict, whatever they're photographing. To show that emotional energy, to engage and touch the viewer in the way that he did, and the best photographs do, many journalists do cite him as an important influence, even if they don't admit it, necessarily, but because it's not easy to do that, to do what he did.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions for tonight. So please join me in thanking our speaker for tonight.
Thank you.